Hello and welcome to the Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Hub for today's webinar, How to Create Speedier and More Nimble Strategies. Next slide, please. We're really grateful to have you here with us today. I also would like to share with you that we are absolutely delighted to be collaborating today with Robert Foster, Senior Consultant at Redwalker. Next slide, please. My name is Francesca and I'm Community Manager at the Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Hub. Next slide, please. Before starting, I just would like to share with you a few housekeeping guidelines. If you could please switch off your mobile phone and laptop notification to the not disturb and make sure that you're in a quiet place. Also, we would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and we will share with you the recording, the video, in our follow-up email. Next slide, please. So at the end of the session, we will be taking your questions. If you can please submit them using the Q&A feature on the toolbar below your screen. Next slide, please. Before starting, I just would like to share with you a little bit more about the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Enterprise Hub. So the Royal Academy of Engineering is the National Academy for Engineers, and it is harnessing the power of engineering to build a sustainable society and an inclusive economy that works for everyone. In collaboration with our fellows and partners, we are growing talent and developing skills for the future, driving innovation and building global partnerships, and influencing policy and engaging the public. Together, we are working to tackle the greatest challenges of our age. And this is where also our Enterprise Hub sits. The Enterprise Hub can be summed in its three main goals, which are to, first of all, inspire and encourage more people to pursue a career as an entrepreneur. And we do this with our Enterprise Fellowship program, where we provide startups and spin-out with seed funding, training, and mentoring. Our aim is also to accelerate innovation. We pursue this aim through our SME Leaders program, where we provide established entrepreneurs with the opportunity to scale up through training and access to network. Finally, our aim is to make the UK a great place for tech entrepreneurs and help build a more resilient ecosystem through policy advice and use of our network, and obviously also events like this. So with no other further ado, I would like to hand it over to Robert Foster from Redwalker, who will let us know more about how to create more speedier and also nimble strategies. Over to you, Robert.
Hi, thank you very much, Francesca, and good morning to everyone in attendance today. Welcome to our session on creating speedier and more nimble strategies. My name's Robert Foster. I'm a senior consultant at Redwalker, and I'll be leading today's session. We're covering an awful lot today. We're doing a lot in 75 minutes. Also sitting in with me today is my colleague, Uday Thacker. He is our TAME strategy expert and also TAME chartered accountant. So if you've got any specific questions about resourcing, how you might want to create nimbler and more speedier strategies, feel free to put questions in to both him and myself in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Fantastic, thank you. So we're going to be covering quite a lot today. This is part of a 5-part series. So the very first couple of slides, we will be looking at a quick recap of some of the earlier sessions we've had. So just a couple of quick slides on strategy, what strategy is, and how we can then begin to extend it is what we'll be looking at for the remaining 4 parts of the program, of the session rather. So we'll be looking at the fundamentals of a changing market to begin with. Then we'll look at what is pivoting, what's the theory, how do we begin to apply it, and then being a bit more specific, looking at your own organizations, what kinds of things do you need to be aware of that might need changing within your own organization for you to be more nimble? And then finally, on a very practical level, part of thinking about developing strategies, refining them, and making sure they're implementable in the real world is by having assumptions, testing assumptions, and then incorporating learning into your strategy. So that's the final part of today's session. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that may be familiar to some of you that have sat in on one or two of the earlier sessions. So this is a nice summary that we use at Red Ochre to look at the entire journey of strategy. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little car. That's a vehicle. The vehicle may be an idea. It may be a company, it may be a consortium of some description, but it's some form of enterprise that enables you to do things. Okay, so that represents you and or your organization. So strategy really is a plan to help you move from where you are to where you want to be. This is a typical logic diagram, so it's normally read from left to right, top to bottom. If you can read the Beano, if you can read a simple comic, you can read a logic diagram. However, I'm going to immediately be contrarian. I like to start to the extreme right. I like to start at the vision. So the sun, that represents effectively a flag in the sand. That's your general direction of travel. That's where you aspire to be. Okay, so that might be to, I don't know, create free or very cheap, non-polluting energy for the entire world. That will make the world a better place. But that might take years, it might take decades, it may never happen. But that does set the direction of travel. Everything you do moves you towards that ultimate vision, that ultimate aim. In the real world, what we tend to do is we try and plan progress in much shorter timescales. So they are interim states. So that might be 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years, that kind of thing. So we start where we are. Okay, that's the current state. So there are various aspects of the current state. So some of those are what we have, our capabilities and our capacity. Some of them might be the environment. So what's the world look like around us? What's the market failure? What's the competition doing? And then in the future, we have different states. So we have greater capabilities, greater capacity. The market failure is less because we've addressed the market failure a little bit. So we actually run between our current state, our intermediate state, and the flag in the sand, the ultimate vision, along a road. So our road is represented by a big arrow in the middle, and it's bound on a couple of sides. So we have our strategic scope is bound really by our resources and our competencies, what we can do and what we have that enables us to do what we want to do. That will change as we get more money, as we grow, as we develop more technologies or more IP. That part of the road gives us greater leeway to make different choices. One part of our strategic scope that shouldn't really change too much is our values, the way we either behave or the way we wish to be perceived to be behaving. So those are our values. So if we want to be seen as an inclusive organization, we don't suddenly want to not be inclusive. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I've got a couple of little caveats. Hopefully, because I've tried to inject a little bit of humor, you should be able to remember these. The very first is about speed. Now, speed is relative. In a competitive market, or the north here, you don't need to be faster than the polar bear. All you need to be is faster than that guy running. Okay, so speed is relative in the marketplace. Next slide, please. Another thing we're going to look at very briefly, what does nimble mean? Within this context, nimble means a sustained ability to effectively respond to the demands of change. Okay, so there are a couple of key phrases here that are really important. So the very first is sustained. So this means you have a process. This is repeatable. It's I'm going to use a horrible phrase. It's a bit 1990s, but it's a core competency. So it's not a project. It's not something you you do every now and again. It's something you do all of the time. So it's something that's embedded within the DNA of your organization. So you do this again and again. The other really important thing is about responding to change. Okay. So the response part means that it doesn't mean, for instance, that you have a strategy and then you just carry on regardless, or it doesn't mean you don't have a strategy and then you're only adaptable. What it means is you have a strategy and you have your eyes open. You're aware of what the market is telling you, what is changing. Your customers, your competition, the center of gravity of society, where is that going? So the key takeaway from this is to be truly nimble, you shouldn't be a flash in the pan. Okay, so hopefully this little mnemonic will help you remember that. Not a flash in the pan. This is a process you can repeat again and again and again. Thank you. Next slide, please. So you've probably heard a little bit about agile at times, agile, nimble. These kind of words are used very interchangeably along with words like lean. I thought I would take a little moment to give you another caveat and draw a distinction explicitly between agile projects and agile strategy. So agile projects are running projects in an agile way. So the important thing here is to understand what a project is. So a project is time bound, it has a beginning and an end, it has limited resources, limited people, it has specific outputs, and it's tightly defined by scope. There are lots and lots of tools you can use, sprints and scrum, synchronize and stabilize, there's a dozen and more. The important thing is this is a tactical approach to applying agile. Okay, so this is how you deploy limited resources in limited time to get something you want. Okay, so scope is what's important here. When we're thinking about strategy, a strategy is a helicopter view. We're taking in everything that the organization should be aware of. So you're taking a step back, you're looking internally and externally. You're trying to evaluate the environment in its widest context. The important bit here is to think that the feedback comes from the market. So this is not what you're in charge of. You are being receptive. Okay, so being agile from a strategic perspective is looking around, environmental scanning, being aware of inputs into your organization and adjusting accordingly. Thank you. Next slide, please. Cool. So what we're going to do now, oh, sorry, before I carry on, Uday, do you have anything you'd like to add to the recap of strategy?
No, I'm fine. Carry on.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to look now at the fundamentals of a changing market. So there are only three main things to think about. What is the problem? Is it an imagined problem? Is it real? Who has the problem? Is it someone that can pay? Is it someone that can't pay? Is it somebody you have access to? Is it somebody you don't have access to? And what's your solution? Is it an idea? Is it an extension of what you currently got? Is it better than the competition? Okay, so those are the three main things that we're going to be looking at in this section. Next slide, please. So we're going to look now at what is the problem. So a lot of the time, technical people or inventors, what they do is they get in love with a problem that they think exists. So do you know that the problem is real, or is it something that you've imagined? Okay, that's the first thing. You can begin to make a slightly more robust body of evidence by thinking about, have you observed the problem, the market failure? Okay, so who have you seen have this problem? Where did you see it? Can you get any evidence? If you're trying to have a relationship with a funder or an investor of some description and have this and open a conversation, having robust evidence of need is a really good starting point. To extend that a little bit more, we might think, has this market failure, has this problem been modeled in some way? So is there research? So is it your research, your primary research, desk research? Is there a body of literature or evidence, maybe in the learned journals, for instance, or maybe has Panorama done an hour on it in the evening? And then lastly, have you experienced this yourself? Now, it's interesting that the relationship, the dynamic between model data. Oh, sorry, can you please go back one slide? Yeah, so it's interesting that the relationship between modeled market failures or problems and experienced. So modeled market failures are really robust because there's evidence to suggest and prove, in fact, that there's this problem and it exists. If you've experienced it, your body of evidence is much smaller. It's worst case scenario, it's you. So there's one data set, one data point that says there's this problem. However, the upside is if you've experienced a problem, you're probably highly likely to be very motivated to bring about a solution and help other people that you imagine have this problem. So there is a strange tension between being highly motivated and having because you've experienced a market failure, and having robust data sets because you've got data on observation or modeling. Thank you. Next slide, please. So who has the problem? So this is a really interesting part of the issue around being nimble and receptive. So a lot of the time, technical people, inventors, people on the technical end of the spectrum that are coming up with new products and service innovations, they will often focus on what it is that they're producing, the product, the service, the features of something, rather than who's going to use it. And even if they do think about, oh, someone might use it, they don't necessarily think about, is this person going to use it or are they going to pay for it? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to draw a little bit of a distinction between customers and users. So a user and a super user might be, if you have maybe some kind of a plugin for a MOOC, maybe some kind of online training thing that you might be able to use in schools. A super user might be a teacher, and the user might be students in school. Neither of them actually pay for your service. A specifier might be maybe head of subject, maybe the senior science tutor, for instance. The paying customer might be the bursar or the headmaster or headmistress. Okay, so there'll be different people that are involved in the purchasing decision and also the using decision. Sometimes they'll be the same. So it might be, I'm going to buy some coffee for myself because I like coffee. So in that case, I'm the user and the customer. But the vast majority of us, if we're providing services or products to government, to the NHS, to companies, that won't be the case. It's only really if you're engaging with members of the public. There's a couple of other types of people that you should probably be aware of, that, and most people have got a vague passing familiarity with this, but they don't pay a great deal of attention. You might have come across phrases like champion if someone in your organization has said to you, we need to do a stakeholder analysis. So when we're thinking about stakeholders, we think about people that are interested in what we're doing, whether they know or not. And most of the time we focus on champions because we like to see the positive in anything. So this is someone that's going to say, oh, you should buy this product because it's great. Maybe we should look at a demo of this service because it sounds interesting. So they seem to be blowing the trumpet for you. So this kind of stakeholder is a really good person to try and cultivate. The vast majority of entrepreneurs that we engage with tends to gloss over the flip side. So this is a stakeholder, someone that's not necessarily directly involved in the purchasing decision, that doesn't really want us to succeed. So this is normally called a saboteur, someone that's trying to make noise in the marketplace to either stop us getting attention or because they feel themselves threatened. So externally, it might be someone in the media, it might be a local commissioner for a local authority, for instance. Internally, it might be I don't know, head of, if we refer back to my example of providing an online learning platform into a school, it might be the head of IT that feels threatened because you're an external supplier bringing in technology that they feel that they should be in charge of, they should be specifying, they should be driving. Okay, so that's a quick recap of the difference between customers and users and the various flavors of them. The other thing to consider is funding, how money is going to be extracted from your customers, your potential customers. So if we're thinking about funding, we might think about can our customers fund themselves? So a school bursar or a headmistress can probably fund themselves because they have their own budget. You might find that if you're providing services or technology to, I don't know, maybe a member of the public that's being discharged from hospital, for instance, they might need a piece of monitoring equipment, for instance. They're not going to pay for that product or service, but the NHS is, for instance. So you might find a variety of different types of funders that are in a position to provide you with your funding stream. So without a funding stream, you don't have a viable business. So this is a key takeaway from this. Okay, so anything you can do to constantly evaluate what the market conditions are for receptive clients is a good thing. Next slide, please. And lastly, before we get on to understand the strategy behind pivoting, a couple of slides on solution. So we've already alluded to the fact that lots of inventors and technical specialists focus on the solution. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that this is part of a wider way of thinking about strategy. So I'm not saying for a moment, don't concentrate on this. I'm just saying pay attention to other things. But if you're going to play to your specialisms, now is the time to do it. So does your idea exist now? Is it an idea? Is it protectable? Do you have IP? Yeah. So if you've got something interesting and innovative, you don't necessarily want to give away your secrets. You might find that instead of going down the IP route and getting trademarks and patents, it might be a more defensible position to take your idea to market quickly, and so you get first mover advantage, or you get lots and lots of customers, and then you have effectively a barrier to entry for new competitors, and it's not based on IP, but it's based on your ability to engage effectively with the customers, the paying customer. Extending this questioning a little bit more, is this product an evolution of what already has gone before, or is it something truly revolutionary? So you might find that if it's evolutionary, there will be potentially some customers that might already be interested in further development. So you might have a footprint of likely customers already. So you need to find out who those customers are, and are they willing to go on with you on that journey to develop it and see where the solution's going. The focus of this slide is really internal, thinking about the strengths of your own solution, but being nimble and thinking about developing speedier and more adaptable solutions and strategies really is an external process. You need to look externally. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pose some questions now. These are rhetorical questions for you to consider, not to discuss now. But is your solution better than a competition? Is it faster than a competition? Is it cheaper? Is it easier or more accessible to use or gain access to for your customers than the competition? Because unless you're coming up with absolutely a new product or service or a market segment, the likelihood is there will be either direct or indirect competition. So direct competition, most organizations don't really have direct competition. This means someone that's doing exactly the same product or service, more or less at the same price points, to the same people at the same time in the same area. The vast majority of organizations don't think they have indirect competition, but most organizations do have lots and lots of indirect competition. So when thinking about indirect competition, it's more about the benefit that customers derive from what you do. They may use different solutions to get this solution, fulfill their need. in order for you to be truly receptive and know where you are in the marketplace, it will be a very good idea to understand who your customer is, understand the benefits that they derive from either your solution or your proposed solution, and then think about who else is doing similar things. You might choose to, referring back to the very first session on strategy, choose to do maybe a business modeling exercise on your competition. So maybe do a quick business model canvas and deconstruct, reverse engineer your competition, for instance. That might be an interesting exercise for you to do, and compare the relative strengths or weaknesses of your model compared to theirs. Thank you. Next slide, please. And just a very, very quick caveat. So this is about using the right words. I'm going to change the names to protect the innocent, but one of our clients is heavily involved in wearable technology, and they interchangeably use words like minimum viable product, prototype, and production ready. And that's fine as far as it goes internally. But as soon as they started having conversations externally with investors, they were pulled up very quickly. So this is quite important, but relatively trivial, because I'm sure that we all know the difference between a minimum viable product. So this is something that proves proof of concept. So on the left here, for instance, we have a set of standing stones, Stonehenge, in fact. Some people think that it might be a way to tell time. A prototype, look in the middle, a bit of clockwork 300 or 400 years ago. This is a way to tell time relatively accurately. Nowadays, though, if you want to sell a watch in large numbers to lots of people, you need something production ready, nice and shiny, something like an iWatch 5, something along those lines. So just be aware that there's a life cycle, a developmental direction. This is a product development strategy, by the way, if you're reading from left to right, going for a minimum viable product, prototype, and then production ready, and then scaling to the marketplace. Uday, before I go into the next part of this, do you have any comments or anything you'd like to add on the fundamentals of the changing marketplace?
Only to just building on that point that Robert made, and reflecting back on what he said earlier when he was talking about intellectual property rights and so on, that sometimes it may be strategically appropriate to get your prototype into market and keep changing it to meet market demand and feedback you get, just to get first mover advantage.
Cool, fantastic, thank you. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the theory behind pivoting. So what is pivoting? So in order to understand pivoting, we have to just cast our mind back and remember what were the fundamentals of a changing marketplace. So the changing marketplace is what's the problem, who has the solution, who has the problem, and what is the solution. So when we're thinking about understanding pivoting, we have to understand changes to each of those three things. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about those fundamental parts of the market that are changing, there are some things to consider. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and I'm sure that Uday may want to kind of chip in here with lots of his evidence and experience. But pivoting around your problem. So this is when you have a well-identified problem. So a really good example, this is one I've only come across relatively recently, is bubble wrap. Bubble wrap back in the day was a wall covering. So it's a bit like, those are kind of wheatgrass stuff you had on the walls in the 1970s instead of wallpaper. It was originally a business consumer product. About the same time, PCs started being shipped in large quantities. So some bright spark realized that actually bubble wrap was a great way to protect delicate pieces of equipment. So through usage, in fact, rather than specifically to begin with, but the organization that made bubble wrap realized that people were beginning to use bubble wrap in different ways. So different people using it for different purposes. So that changed. Interesting example. So the next thing is pivoting around the customer. So the moving from one customer segment to another. So this is an interesting example. This is another client of ours. They have a ultra real time, less than 1 second latency, pediatric vital sign monitoring for basically very young kids, so neonatals, effectively. Originally was going to be in hospital. Unfortunately for them, they hadn't really looked at the wider marketplace, and they realized that there was a lot of noise in the marketplace, lots of competition, lots of different types of technology at higher end, at lower end, and also in the middle, in the space that they were in. So everything from big machines with multiple arrays of sensors through to patch technology that would monitor for 2 or 3 hours at a time. They looked around and then realized that actually EMTs in the ambulance service didn't have access to this, and there was nothing was available. So all they did was pick up a small child, make sure that they had a little bit of air, and then rush them to hospital as quickly as possible. So at first glance, this looks to be the same customer type, but actually they're very different. If you look at hospital, that's funded by normally an NHS trust, a hospital trust, and the uses of doctors or pediatric intensive care nurses. The ambulance service is funded separately through ambulance trusts, and the users are EMTs and paramedics. So you might find that by shifting your focus slightly, you might find a market opportunity for customers that feel more acute pain. And then lastly, thinking about the solution itself. So you might actually pay less attention to the customer and think a bit more about the solution. So a great example is Tesla. Tesla are orders of magnitude more advanced than Clive Sinclair and his washing machine, his Sinclair C5, which had a range of 5 or 6 miles. I wouldn't want to go on a motorway, and I don't think I'd be allowed to in a C5, but I'd quite happily go on a motorway in a Tesla. Okay, so better battery technology equals better range for electric vehicles. A more up-to-date, a more timely example of this is Barbour, the manufacturers of outdoor waterproof clothing. They've done an interesting pivot during COVID from waterproofs into personal protective equipment for various people. So that's an interesting, very, very nimble change. If they were part of a much larger organization, they may not have been able to do that. Because they're relatively small and got quick decision making, they're able to do so. Fantastic, thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Uday?
No, all I would say is that the pivoting actually comes down to a philosophy of mind. That is, it's not just your strategy. Does the management have the nimbleness to turn around and say, let's react quickly to our current situation? Robert mentioned about Barbour moving from waterproofs to PPE because there was an urgent need for that. Nobody was going out and shopping for their normal clothing. But similarly, Innocent went from making fruit juices to making hand sanitizers because they had all the machinery and so on, and said, actually, there's a greater need for this. We can make more money and actually do some public good. And we're able to quickly pivot around what they were doing to do that. And probably now that the shops are opening, I'll go back to making juice.
Cool. Thank you, Uday. Next slide, please. So taking what we've said so far and trying to summarize it, here are some examples of the kinds of strategies you might try to apply to your own organization as it develops, as it changes. So once again, not wishing to labor the point, being agile and being speedy is about being receptive and being able and willing to change quickly. So the idea is understanding where you are and then moving to the next option. So I'm not going to go through this in a great deal of detail because I'm aware that we've not got a great deal of time. And this is the kind of thing that's interesting for you to look at and reflect on yourself. You'll have a copy of the notes that'll be sent through to you by Francesca and the rest of the team in due course. What we're going to do now is move on to part 4, which is extending Uday's comments about what needs to change in order for your organization to be nimble. So next slide, please. Cool. So as you can see, the answer to that question is a lot. A lot needs to change for an organization to be nimble. Now, the thing is, not all of these things will necessarily have to change for your organization to be nimble. You might choose to focus on 1 or 2 specific things, but by turn, I'll just quickly scoot through a few of the kind of high level headlines here. So the first thing is people. So we're going to start with people. So this is really the people that work for you and your supply chain. It includes you a little bit, but we'll address that a little bit more explicitly under the leadership and management discussion. But for your people, it really comes down to culture, risk profile, the appetite for risk. It's all well and good for you to say you want your staff to be receptive to market changes, to be able to make decisions on their own. But if it goes wrong, if something goes wrong and you blame them, your staff are not going to want to engage with this way of doing things. They are going to be referring back to a work by rule kind of process. They'll be very very process driven, and they won't want to engage with nimble. So that's a really important thing to consider. It's not only about you and management and leadership, it's also about your staff and how you treat your staff. And do you blame them when things go wrong? Do you share reward with them when things go right? Another thing to think about with your people is, are there enough people? Do you have enough time? Have you given them flexibility in how they address their workload? Do you allow them to consider, reflect, and then react? What about how they communicate with you? What about power distance? Those kinds of things. Cool. So that's kind of your people, the sorts of things you're going to have to consider when you're hiring, inducting, and just generally managing your staff. If we move over to strategy, systems and infrastructure rather, organizations that have many layers where people can say yes or no to something tends to be slower. So there's a phrase that no doubt you've heard: organizational inertia. This means organizations move slowly, like big super tankers at sea. They take a long time to turn around a corner, maybe 2 or 3 miles. Compare that to a dinghy. There's 1 or 2 people. It's very small. It's very light. You can make decisions and change quickly. So one of the best ways to increase the speed decision making and be more nimble is to have less people making the decisions. And that's not to say don't have individuals feeding into the decision making process. It means don't have multiple steps for decision making. Okay, so that's a really important thing. The next point, which kind of related to having enough time for people to think about things, to add value and do interesting things, is anything you can do to automate, delegate, or outsource mundane or low value activity is a good thing, because that means this low value stuff is parked. Your staff and all of the soft squishy bits that the people, consultants, your management team, they can add value by thinking, okay? Because you are high functioning individuals. Your organizations are doing some really interesting things. Okay? You want your staff to be able to add value and not just be, I don't know, answering a register, for instance, that kind of, or taking a register. Okay, so you want to do free up as much of the capacity of your staff as you possibly can. The same goes for decision-making processes. Anything you can do to have a process to make sure that that happens for non-contentious things is a great thing. Okay, because this takes the guesswork out of it, so you can spend more time on the stuff that makes the difference. Being receptive, listening to the market, making decisions quickly, and then implementing change. A similar way of thinking about this is any processes you have, if you can have them in a modular way. So if some of you are involved in high technology, maybe software development or maybe hardware development, you're familiar with kind of modular or object-oriented processes. Anything where you can have little Lego blocks in your system is a great thing, because you might find that you can circumvent certain Lego blocks in certain process or as needs change. So modular systems tend to be pretty flexible. When we're thinking about leadership, this is a bit like thinking about your people, but instead of thinking of the people below you, it's about looking at your peers. It's about looking in the mirror. So don't forget that there is a difference between leadership and management. So leadership is potentially figuring out where the direction of travel is. Cast your mind back to the first couple of slides. The sun to the extreme right. Okay, so this is where you want to get to. Management is the practicalities of using limited resources and limited time to get there. Okay, so do you lead from the front or do you lead from behind? Do you shout at your people or do you serve them? Do you try and help your staff unleash their potential? Do you support them so so you don't shout at them, you don't blame them, that's gone wrong? Or do you say, I hope you learned from that, better luck next time? Okay, so trust goes both ways. This is the important takeaway from this. Don't separate yourself necessarily. Don't think that you're a manager or a leader. You are part of the team. Okay, you may be aside from the team, but you're still part of the team. And then lastly, this entire session is really about strategy. So I'm going to kind of square the circle about what needs to change for your organization to be nimble, to finish up on strategy. So the important thing is the direction of your strategy, the high level direction, the flag in the sand stays the same. That shouldn't really change, because that sets the agenda for the next 5, 10, 15 years. What will change is an awareness of the marketplace, accepting there are going to be changes to the market. Sometimes you'll be able to just do things a bit better and take advantage. Other times you will need to make specific changes. So you might need to pivot, casting your mind back to pivoting. Other things to think about when we're considering our strategy. If you have the opportunity to prepare for change, do so now. Okay, so it's all well and good being efficient. So efficiency is doing as much as you possibly can with the minimum resource. That's great, as long as things don't change. As soon as things change, you need a bit of time for someone to think. If they're spending all of the time working on billable work, they're not able to think. Okay, so if you can, try and build in some spare capacity. So this is a good time to do things. If we're in a slowdown, if you've got a little bit of money, if you've got a bit of time, you can begin to consider how you build in resilience to your organization. And the other thing is looking at, if we take our Prime Minister as an example, it's a very fine line to consider acting too fast or acting too slow. So the only real bit of advice I can give to you is, well, there's two bits. The first is that only with hindsight could we say with any degree of certainty that we made the right decision. But when we're in the decision-making process, the more information you have and the more up-to-date information that you have, the more likely you are to be in a better place to say, I should make a move now, I should make that change now. Cool. So Uday, do you have any comments or questions on that brief summary of what needs to change before I kind of jump into specifics? I guess that's a no. Okay, cool. So next slide, please. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to conflate two of those parts of that last slide, really. So this is about not only your people and the culture that your people needs to be in, inculcated into, but also you as the leader, the entrepreneur, maybe a member of the senior management team. So there's different ways to help individuals within an organization be nimble, to be prepared for change. The first is by giving them the appropriate tools. So these might be models or frameworks, business methodologies, those kinds of things. So it might be market research, for instance, that kind of thing, a tool set. Skills are really how to use a tool or a methodology in an appropriate way. So thinking about providing knowledge and maybe training on Prince 2 or business modeling or quantitative research is all well and good, effectively useless unless your staff are allowed to practice those skills. And then lastly, and this is the most interesting one and probably the most overlooked one, and it's kind of squaring the circle a bit with what Udo said before, it's about the mindset. In order for any investment in your people to pay dividends, they've got to want to be able to practice those skills and use those tools. Okay, and this really applies to you. So I'm going to be a little bit flippant now and say it's all well and good knows what a press up is. Okay, so tool sets, skill sets, and mindsets, they all go together. Cool. Next slide, please. Fantastic.
I'm going to step in here because I think Robert's can't hear Robert. I think again this is Robert's point is building on the point you made earlier, is that basically you want to create a broad vision for all your employees, everyone involved in your delivery. What is the broad vision? What is it that you want to achieve? And then give them specific things to focus on so that they're responsible for their part of the business, the enterprise, and what they need to deliver. And with a clear understanding that they have the support, they have the tool sets and the skills to actually help deliver the broader vision. I think Robert's back now, and I'll hand back to him.
Fantastic, thank you. What I did there was obviously on purpose to illustrate a couple of points. The first is how to build resilience into a system. So Uday was here while I had issues with my internet connection. And the next is to be agile and assume that there will be negative and positive events in anything you deliver. So thank you, Uday, for illustrating that point nicely. I think Uday's covered that slide. So next slide, please. Brilliant. So expanding that a little bit more, there's this incredibly famous diagram that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, and it kind of illustrates the difference between deliberate strategies and emergent strategies or emerging strategies. So deliberate strategies are a little bit old school, if you pardon the expression. This is the way strategy and business planning used to be delivered in the 80s, 90s, and in even early 2000s, thinking about the world is relatively stable. We are in a golden age of commercialism and consumerism, and that market conditions will only ever get better, and the speed of technological innovation will only ever increase. So the assumption broadly was that the world, there will always be more customers, they'll always have more money, and there will be relatively few constraints on consumer growth. Recently, we've begun to see with things like wildfires, floods, with COVID-19. I think something else I read today, there's a bubonic plague outbreak in China, in Mongolia as well now, I think. So it looks like there are going to be lots and lots of different drivers on any strategy. So there are market changes, so there are issues around mobility, about money, about consumerism, about logistics and transport, money flow, all sorts of things. So emergent strategy is about understanding that we have a direction of travel, and that we absolutely will have an opportunity and a need to change direction, or a pivot on a relatively small way, but very, very regularly. So in a practical way, when you're applying this to your own organization, if you're going to do deliberate strategy, you might have a strategy that lasts 10 years, then you might write maybe a 3 or 5 year business plan. If you're applying an emergent strategy to your organization, you might have a broad, maybe 1 or 2 page strategy for 5 or 10 years, and then you would probably have a slightly more considered or detailed business plan for maybe 3 years, and then you'd have an actual detailed operational, marketing and new product introduction plan for maybe a year at a time, rolling forward in 3 month or maybe 6 month segments. So the idea is that you build in opportunities to understand how the market's changing, and then give the opportunity to make those changes. So that's what the emergent strategy is. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do now is think a little bit about testing your assumptions, because up until now, we've assumed that you know what your customers want, that you know that your product works, that you know that your customers are willing to pay a specific price. Now, this is all well and good, but at the end of the day, this is just what you're intuiting, it's what you're thinking. If you have evidence, that is much better. So to start this section, I've got a quick slide, and this is a relatively famous rule for people that are in market research or research generally. For some reason, it's not widely known, and I don't know why, because this is one of the most important rules that I kind of adhere to on a pretty much a day-to-day basis. It's called the 133 rule. And it's important because it illustrates the difference between what people say they will do and what they actually do. So you might ask 100 people, will you vote for me? Will you come to my barbecue? Will you buy my product? 30 will say yes, 3 actually do. So the important bits here are 100. 100 is representative of the whole market. 30 is your addressable market, and 3 is actually the ones that put their hand in their pocket, leap over that barrier to entry and pay for something. Okay, so the difference is 30 is the people that say they'll do something, 3 is the ones that actually do something. So that's the important part, the 30 to 3, not the 100 to 30 or the 100 to 3. Okay, next slide, please. Fantastic, super. So how are we doing for time? We've got a few minutes, so I'll take my time on this. So designing and implementing your test is quite an important thing to do, and I'm going to make a bit of an assumption that pretty much everyone listening to this session will be aware of how to design tests, because you'll be technical, you may be scientists, so you know about single variable tests, you'll know about testing a hypothesis, you know about having a wide enough sample set, you know about having a long enough sampling frequency and sampling mechanisms. So For those of you that aren't familiar, I'll very, very quickly, here are a couple of key takeaways. The most important thing to do is test one variable at a time. So if, for argument's sake, you are sending out a newsletter, or you're sending out 6 different newsletters to people via email, and you're putting different prices in each one, you're putting different messages in each one, and you're trying to sell different products, and one of those messages, one of those test emails is really successful and the others aren't, you don't know why that was successful, because you're testing more than one variable at a time. So try and keep things simple. Okay, I know we really want answers quickly, but if you rush, you'll probably end up with muddy data, and that won't really tell you a great deal. Okay, so the next thing is, think about what is it you're trying to test. Okay, so are you trying to test, do people want your product? Do you want to test, do they actually have a need? Or is it a bit more commercial? You're trying to figure out how much money they're willing to pay for a product or service. So think specifically about what is it you're trying to test. What is your hypothesis? So once you have a hypothesis, you are then in a position to be able to design a single variable test. Okay. And there are lots of ways to do this. The first is really a kind of a deliberate approach. So this is getting big data sets. So this is about long time studies, longitudinal studies. This is about large data sets. So this is the kind of thing that pharmaceuticals or medical technology companies do, because they want to know with a high degree of confidence that a drug won't kill you, basically, because a dead customer is basically bad for business. For the vast majority of us, though, we don't need that massively high degree of confidence. We are more interested in rapid feedback. So this is more of a mental way of thinking about things, a philosophical mindset. Quick tests, smaller sample sizes, get the test out, get the data back, gain insight as quickly as you can. Once you've gained your insight, you have the opportunity now to either validate your assumptions. My hypothesis was correct, or gee, my hypothesis was completely wrong. People just don't want my product at all because I had zero interest. Or for the vast majority of us, we will find that some of our hypothesis was correct and it just needs refinement. So we might take the information from our tests and refine our hypothesis or amend our hypothesis. So the key takeaway for that is you probably won't have one test. You'll probably have a series of tests, one after the other, refining a hypothesis, refining your price points, refining what customers want, the features, the benefits, who your customers are, where your customers are, that kind of thing. Next slide, please. And lastly, here are some simple examples, typical tests you'll see. So I've already referred to A/B tests in passing. So you might have 100 people. You might email 1 to 49 and then 50 to 100. And they would have different messages. So that's an A/B split. You're probably familiar with nth selections. So you might have 1,000 customers and you want to speak to 1,000 customers, but actually talking to 1,000 people is probably going to take a long time and be quite labor intensive, and you might not even finish it. So one way to do this is you might say, talk to every 10th person by introducing randomness into your sample. So the 1st, the 11th, 21st, and so on and so forth. You're not selecting people that are early adopters or based in a specific area or something like that. You're introducing randomness to your sample set. And you're maybe talking to 100 people instead of 1,000 people. So it tends to be representative. It's not fully robust, but it's a good way of doing things. And there are various other ways, instead of talking to people and sampling them, ways to test their behavior. So there's observation. There's the famous example of McDonald's and milkshakes. McDonald's went through, I think it was McDonald's, they went through a whole process of market research, rebranding and relaunching their milkshakes, thinking that they would make lots and lots of money. They would increase the number of people that drinking their milkshakes and increased number of people that are coming back to buy them, they found that after like 3 years of this process, there was zero change in return rate, people coming back and buying more, zero change in profit, and zero change in revenue from this particular revenue stream. What they decided to do then was sit outside McDonald's drive-through in a car, and they realized that about 50% of McDonald's milkshakes are bought before 8 in the morning. And then they talked to those people, and they figured out that people buy McDonald's milkshakes at a drive-through because it's an easy way to get breakfast in the morning. So then they didn't necessarily have lots of answers, but then they at least were able to start asking the right questions. So they begin to think about, do we make the milkshakes thicker so that they take longer and they appear to be better value to the people? Do we make them more filling? Do we have different flavors, and so on and so forth? So it gives them a whole new theme of inquiry to explore. And then some more interesting and more modern, I guess, ways to test crowdfunding, pre-sales, or maybe for a product, or pre-sales for an event or a service or a presentation on Eventbrite. They're good ways to gauge people's actual appetite for a product or service. Are they prepared to pay money for what you do, or are they just going to say yes? If you get lots of people signing up for an event, great, run the event. If people aren't signing up for the event, well, there's either no need, the price is too high, the message is wrong, or the topic's wrong, or the people just don't care. You just give the money back then, just refund them. You haven't lost anything, but you've now got much more information about who's likely to buy from you. And then there's the famous example of Innocent, going back to one of Udo's favorite case studies. Innocent, what they did was they were at an event, I think it was in Brook Green, possibly in southwest London, and they had a table of samples, and they were just asking people, take a drink of that. If you like it, put it in that bin there. It says give up your day job. If you don't like it, put it in that bin there and say it's, keep your job. So actually seeing what your product or service is like at the bleeding edge, where your customers engage with what you do. Thank you very much. That's all I've got to say. Udo, do you have anything to add? I'm aware that we're running out of time. Udo?
No, just following on, just emphasizing what Robert, the example of the milkshake, which has become quite a famous analogy for a lot of the tech companies, is actually try and understand what your customers want and approach it from the customer's point of view, not the product development or market segmentation view.
Brilliant. Thanks, Udo. Francesca, do we have any questions or comments, or would anyone like to discuss any of the points raised? There you go.
I'm here. Yes, here you can hear me all well and loud. So yes, thank you so much, Robert and Udo, for this very insightful, the presentation, on how to make a business speedier and actually more nimble, especially focusing on the strategy. So you can now, of course, ask your question. If you can please submit them using the Q&A feature on the toolbar below. I have a question, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So we were talking about, tests and the importance of testing. I wanted to ask you, when should the test be run?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, actually. There is a danger that you get enamored with running tests and you spend all of your time testing and testing and testing. So you spend more and more of your time getting information and getting insight, but not doing a great deal. The other end of the extreme, you just assume that what you're doing is great, and you just kind of chug on the same way you've always done it. But in the real world, the time that I would suggest that you run a test is when there's something you're unsure of. Okay, so when you're asking yourself a question, you're laying in bed or in the shower and you're thinking, I wonder if, when you feel that in your mind or in your belly, as an entrepreneur, that's when you run the test, because that's when you feel the need.
That's great. Thank you so much. Actually, following up on that, we just had a question. What should be actually the frequency? How often, should we run tests?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I'd be inclined to you start the testing process when there's a need to test. So typically it's when you either are thinking about your marketing. So you might run a load of tests around your marketing. Why is I don't know, this channel or this product more efficient or effective or have a greater yield than another one? Or when you're thinking about changing or introducing a new product. So when you're doing that. So if it's a new product, I would suggest that you have, it's not necessarily a specific frequency or timetable of tests. It's defined really by the length of test, the insight, and what you want to do next. If you get all of the information you need from one test, you only need one test. But if you in the real world, it's unlikely that that's going to happen. So you're probably going to have to run 2 or 3 tests, and I would do them one after the other. So that's kind of a product-based approach to testing. For marketing, I'd be inclined to try and run tests on a relatively regular basis. So at the very least, run a test once a year on your customers. Maybe in a selection, just talk to, I don't know, maybe 100 of your customers or 20 of your customers, or maybe talk to your lapsed customers. That's a good one to do. If you've got a fast-moving product or service, you might shorten that frequency a little bit. You might talk to them more frequently than once a year, but I would definitely not talk to them more than once a quarter, because if you do that, you'll end up with market research fatigue. So your customers will say, I'm your guinea pig, I'm sick of this, you're always asking me questions, leave me alone.
Thank you so much, Robert. Actually, something that we get often asked, when talking about agility, about actually being very nimble with a strategy, is it whether how should we basically behave with an existing strategy? I mean, does it mean that we should always be wary and and prompt our strategy, not having a strategy at all, or what should be the pattern?
Actually, that's a really interesting, it's not only one question, that's like a whole theme of questions. Actually, that's really interesting, because some people think that kind of being agile or nimble or being very kind of quick on your feet means that you don't need any strategy. Kind of like they think that emergent strategy means making it up. That's not actually the case. So you do need a general strategy, a kind of a general direction of travel. Being agile and nimble is really a way of behaving. It's a way of being able and willing to make lots of changes so that you're kind of adhering to the general strategy, the general direction of travel. So using, I'm going to be a little bit flippant here, using an example, getting a spaceship from the Earth to the moon. I think the Apollo spaceships were on course for less than, were actually where they were supposed to be, when they were supposed to be, for less than like 3% of the journey. They constantly made course corrections. So they're constantly figuring out where they came from, the Earth, where they want to get to, the moon, figuring out where they are, and then making tiny corrections to make sure that they actually arrive on time and at the right place. Okay, so that's the essential difference between agile and deliberate. Cool.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you everyone. If you can go to the next slide, please. So we have, come up to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much for attending. Yeah, this is basically the grid of our upcoming webinars from our theme, building future resilience, so how to manage your business throughout the pandemic. We are going to have our next appointment on the 15th of July, and you can find the rest of our webinars on our website. Make sure you do sign up. And thank you so much for everyone who has been part of this event today. And look forward to see you soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.